I'm going to talk a little bit about our application of the LHC science on blue waters. My name is Mark Neubauer. I'm a physics professor at University of Illinois, working in experimental high-energy particle physics. Okay, so the talk is structured. I'd like to talk a little bit about the science, the background a little bit, but I'm going to try to go quickly through that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about, so we've had sort of an initial exploratory allocation, hopefully in lieu of a larger allocation on blue waters. And so sort of split between a little bit of the background of the science and some of the applications we have on blue waters that we've been putting together. Okay, so a little bit of background. So just about particle physics, about our research domain. And what we're trying to do is basically understand the universe at its most fundamental level. And the primary questions we're asking are, what are the elementary constituents of matter? So what is the universe made out of? Those constituents, how do they interact with each other? So what are the forces that dictate their behavior? And even more broadly, we're probing what is the nature of space and time itself. For example, through searching for extra dimensions and things like that. It's quite remarkable that we can sort of summarize the fruits of many decades of labor on one slide to show you what the universe is made out of, at least the known universe. And so this is called the Standard Model of Particle Physics. It's a theory that was pretty much completed in the 70s, and since then has undergone extremely precise and vigorous experimental scrutiny. And so the basic elements are we have matter and we have force-carrying particles. So in particle physics and then in the description of quantum field theory, forces themselves are mediated by other particles. So on the left you see we have, ordinary matter is made of quarks and leptons. And so we have three families of quarks, up, down, charm, strange, top, and bottom quark. These comprise matter, and we have the leptons, for which also comprise matter, which are the electron, the muon, and tau, and their associated neutrino. And sort of I guess I'll point with this. Does the pointer actually work? Okay. And so what we have is the quarks. They feel all of the forces. They feel the strong, the weak, and the electromagnetic interaction being charged. The leptons are charged, and they only feel the weak and electromagnetic interaction. And the neutrinos are almost massless and feel only the weak interactions. So in terms of these interactions I just mentioned, there's the force-carrying particles. So these are the particles that mediate the interactions between the fundamental particles. We have the photon, which is massless and interacts and mediates the electromagnetic interaction. We have the strong interactions as mediated by 8 gluons. These are what bind quarks together to form hadrons. And we have the W and Z particles that mediate the weak interaction, which dictates the radioactive decay of nuclei. And so one of the mysteries we've had in this theory is that we have these massless force carriers, namely the photon and the gluons, but then we have these very heavy force carriers that mediate the weak interactions. So there's a central question in our field is why is it that the force carriers of the weak interaction are heavy, whereas the other ones are massless? And what ties this all together is a particle that, in fact, one particle I didn't mention, which is the Higgs boson, which in fact explains in the standard model how that discrepancy between the heavy force carriers and the light force carriers. And in fact, it completes the picture of the standard model of particle physics. It really explains the origin of particle mass itself. And this is a particle that has never been observed before until 2012, and I want to say a few things about that. So and I should also mention all these particles, you have to double them because they have antimatter partners, although some of the particles themselves are their own antiparticles. And this also, I should say, describes the electromagnetic, the strong, and the weak interactions, but doesn't describe gravity. So bringing gravity into this theory has been very challenging. So I sort of say some assembly required, you have to put these parts together, gravity not included. Okay, so how do we look for new particles? Well, we basically do what we did as children. We smash stuff together and see what comes out. Except for we do it a lot more rapidly, and we do it with much more expensive toys. So we have what allows us to do this is sort of a gift we have from Einstein, which is the familiar E equals mc squared. Basically says that we can accelerate particles, impart them with energy, and convert them to mass directly. And that's what we do in particle colliders. We smash protons together after we've given them a lot of energy and momentum. And when we do that, we find that new particles can come out. For example, the Higgs boson. The challenge is we can't just do this and then kind of like stop the experiment and scoop out the new particles. What happens is these new particles, like the Higgs, are very unstable and leave signatures behind after they decay that we have to figure out. So the experiment we have is the Large Hadron Collider, which is located in Switzerland, and it spans Switzerland and France. It is 27 kilometers, for which we counter-rotate protons. Actually, we counter-rotate bunches of protons, 100 billion bunches of protons counter-rotate and are accelerated to very high energies and then are focused to collide at several interaction points, which we build some of the most sophisticated instrumentation ever developed by mankind. So we have the ATLAS and CMS experiments that actually analyze these proton collisions. And then we have some more specialized detectors, LHCb and ALICE, which I won't really talk about. Okay, so my group at Illinois, we work on the ATLAS experiment, for which particles collide inside the detector, producing heavy new particles, maybe new particles like the Higgs, and then those particles are detected through the instrumentation, like having silicon trackers and calorimeters and things. Okay, so what might this look like if we produced, for example, a Higgs boson in one of these detectors? Here's an example in example in ATLAS of a Higgs candidate. You can see all these interactions happen because we're colliding bunches of protons together, not single protons at a time. But basically, we're producing a spray of particles, and then there's actually 4 high momentum particles, which happen to be, in this case, 4 muons. 2 of them come from one Z boson, and 2 of them come from another Z boson. So that's the kind of thing we're looking for in our experiment. And this kind of science led to, so if we look at we analyze, I just talked about like a candidate going from Higgs to 2 Z particles that mediate the weak interaction. One of those candidates might be in this peak here. And when we start to look at the invariant mass, which basically means we put together the energy and momentum in a particular way, that's an invariant quantity in relativity, a decaying particle will peak in that distribution. And so this is the 2 photon invariant mass, the 4 lepton invariant mass, and something my group worked on, which is in involving W bosons. You put them together and you find excesses beyond our background expectation, all consistent with a single new particle that was never observed before, and that's the Higgs boson, and the 2013 Nobel Prize in Physics went to that discovery. So really this allows us to we enter a new era of particle physics where we can use this Higgs boson that we just discovered, which is the last fundamental particle to be discovered was the top quark in 1995. So this is really the first time a new particle has been discovered in particle physics in 20 years, and it actually completes the standard model picture. We hope that's not the whole story, but yeah, it really opens a new tool, or gives us a new tool. Okay, so the Higgs-like boson, to really discover this particle, it required the analysis of a quadrillion proton-proton collisions, which produced that quadrillion proton-proton collisions produced 2 million Higgs bosons at a bargain of 7,000 a Higgs. The vast majority, now here's one of the key points, is that the reason the science is really hard is because the vast majority of these decays of new particles like the Higgs or other particles we're looking for, they look virtually the same as all the other backgrounds that are produced from all the other standard model processes. So it really is, only a few of them stand out. I actually showed you an event display, which is actually quite distinct. But basically, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack of needles. So our whole science is about having huge volumes of data, being able to mine them in a way that exploits kinematic differences to be able to separate out statistically signals from new physics signals from backgrounds. So this is a famous painting from Norman Rockwell called Freedom from Want. Basically, I like it because it kind of encapsulates the computing problem, I think. We have 15 petabytes of data that's generated per year in these experiments. And then it's up to sort of elderly people, a little bit like me, kind of like elders of the experiment, trying to sort of serve that data to young, hungry graduate students and postdocs so they can make discoveries. So there's the amount of data, but there's also the fact that we have thousands of physicists that collaborated on this experiment all over the world, so it's a really distributed, that want to feast off of this data. And so the Higgs boson discovery is really kind of a success story, I think, of big science with big data. But there's a challenge, the computing itself, it's a lot of data to analyze. I think I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. I didn't want to leave you with the impression that we discovered the Higgs boson and now we're done, because that's clearly not the case. As with all discoveries, they open up new questions, and there's an enormous number of interesting questions still to be explored. Let me just summarize them really briefly. One of the questions is, there's this Higgs boson, and the Standard Model actually predicts a single Higgs boson. It's the excitation of the Higgs field that imparts all the other particles with mass. And there's a question of whether there's other Higgs bosons to be discovered. It's the only spinless particle in the Standard Model. Spinless, scalars tend to like scalars, so there could be many more Higgs bosons. In fact, supersymmetry predicts 5 Higgs bosons. There's also this question of what happens when you use the quantum field theory to calculate the Higgs mass itself. You find that there are loop corrections, there are quantum fluctuations that in fact cause a very large contribution to the Higgs mass, and wants to run the Higgs mass up to the grand unified scale, which is 10 to the 19 GeV. And so the question is, it's kind of a unnatural situation, and we wonder if there's some other physical phenomena that's protecting us against all these quantum corrections. And one of them is his supersymmetry, which cancels out almost exactly diagrams like this and leads to a finite Higgs mass. So that's called the hierarchy problem. It's a bit of a theoretical technical issue, but it kind of looms large in our field. We know that unification of the forces is a guiding principle in physics. We saw electricity and magnetism were unified into a single description, for which relativity enriches that enormously. We know that this electromagnetic and the weak interactions are actually just due to a single force we call the electroweak force, and that is spontaneously broken at some higher energy scale. And then the question is, like, can we keep going? Can we bring in the strong force to the electroweak force at some scale and have a single force that we can describe? These are called grand unified theories, and maybe even bring gravity into this eventually at some higher scale. We know that the universe, through the evolution of the universe, we have strong reason to believe that the universe went through a superluminal expansion of sort of exponential expansion of space-time in the very early universe called inflation. This is needed to describe the homogeneity of the large-scale structure of the universe. What drives this? There's typically scalar fields drive this, and the Higgs is a scalar field. There's a question of whether the Higgs could play a role there. The problem is it has to have some kind of non-standard gravity interactions to do that, but there is a question of whether Higgs could play this role. Why is there this vast dominance of matter over antimatter in the universe? Why you don't annihilate into light when you sat down today? And are neutrinos their own antiparticle? Why do they have such little mass? And also two of them, which is what is the nature of dark matter and dark energy? And I wanted to leave you with the point that all these questions can be addressed with the Large Hadron Collider and the science we're doing. Doesn't mean we'll make discoveries that'll answer them, but certainly we're sensitive to them. In terms of the computing challenges, as I mentioned, we have petabytes and petabytes of data that have to be processed, and we have to sort of process them to generate higher level objects. For example, when the collisions happen, we see basically just charge deposits on our silicon detectors or calorimeter or hits in calorimeter cells. We have to construct them into high-level objects we can use for physics, like electrons, photons, and things like that. And that requires a very intensive set of event processing to do. We also need, in order to interpret our data, we really rely on simulation to interpret the data, so we have to generate hundreds and hundreds of billions of simulated data events to have any hope to be able to make a convincing demonstration that we can see physics beyond the Standard Model. And so in the LHC computing model, we have this sort of hierarchical model. Now, I should say that we are trying to flatten that out. But traditionally, we've had this model where the data comes from Tier 0 at CERN. It then goes to regional centers, for which the US has one of these called Tier 1s at Brookhaven, and then eventually comes down to a set of Tier 2 centers, for which most of the simulation, the vast majority of the simulation, data processing, and data analysis occur. One of those Tier 2 centers is at the University of Illinois, and is a consortium we call the Midwest Tier 2 Center between Chicago, Indiana University, and University of Illinois. So here with the miracle of Google Map, I've thrown that on there. Basically, it's a three-site consortium for which we try to make a single site out of these three resources, both in terms of data flow and processing, and utilize the high network bandwidth we have there. I mentioned this for a specific reason I'll get to in a second. You may wonder why I'm mentioning that Tier 2. I just wanted to mention that this is actually the largest, it's the second largest computing facility that is this Tier 2 in all of Atlas, behind the Brookhaven Tier 1 in terms of all of them in the world. So it's the world's largest Tier 2 center. I mention this because, okay, now I come back to Blue Waters. And so what is the LHC science we're doing on Blue Waters? So I mentioned this campaign of simulating events, data analysis and data processing. And So this is one of the applications we have on the Blue Water supercomputer, and where we're basically doing large-scale simulation, data processing, and data analysis of this proton-proton collisions, the LHC. The approach we've taken is to highly leverage what we've done at the Midwest Tier 2. So we actually hang off the Midwest Tier 2, leverage the services from the Midwest Tier 2, and also the open science grid, and container technologies like we utilize Shifter Docker, Docker images within Shifter on Blue Waters. And the Blue Waters platform is really ideal for us, not only the proximity to our Tier 2, but also it sort of has this large CPU resource and also great large storage resources and networking resources, which is really important for us, especially the networking, being able to flow data into this machine and flow it out as it's processed. The other one, which is really sort of a revolution in our field in a lot of ways, we'll see is so in high energy physics, as in many fields, any domains, as well as industry, we're sort of latching onto the fact that we're understanding that machine learning has a great promise for sort of revolutionizing or changing the way we do our searches for new phenomena. And so, for example, over decades and decades, we've figured out the best, we think through our neural nets have figured out the best ways to look at our data. But what we're finding, and we've developed high-level analyses and variables and things of our data, but we're finding if we go back to raw data and we let the machines figure out what the optimal variables, they do rediscover some of the things that we found, but also have, in many ways, more sensitive ways of looking at the data, so we just sort of give it up to the machines. But this is for us a very emerging area, and many of the things that we're looking at are mapped well onto these sort of visual problems that are that you find in other fields, so like visual recognition, things that model the evolved visual cortex of the mammalian brains. For example, I'll show you an example in a second. So the approach we're using on Blue Waters, so we have a number of machine learning applications on Blue Waters for high energy particle physics. Our approach is really not to reinvent the wheel, but to use industry standard machine learning tools, and we've demonstrated many of these to work fine on Blue Waters with our application. And so the Blue Waters platform for us is really ideal because we really thirst after a large GPU resource that's connected well to data. And that's going to be a theme in the last part of my talk, is about the fact that we can achieve the first part, that is being able to, if you want to do machine learning, deep learning, pass through lots and lots of data into deep neural nets, you need to be able to have access to that data and be able to flow that through the deep learning algorithms. And so being able to pull off one enables being able to use the machine learning applications for the science. Part one, in terms of being able to process and simulate events. So we leveraged off the Midwest Tier 2, and in fact, we use sort of up to 48 glidins with Condor glidins. Okay, so with 16 nodes per glidin, 16 cores per node. We can't actually use all the cores because of the memory footprint, so we use 16 cores per node. In the end, we had a small initial allocation of 50,000 node hours, and we were able to using 12,000 cores, we used our 50K in a week. And then I did the sort of Oliver Twist thing, and I said, can I have a little bit more? Because we kind of overshot ourselves. We basically consumed all our resources, demonstrating that we can pull this off. There's an enormous number of technical challenges that we had to overcome, and we worked with the Blue Waters application support team very closely, and I think also the Blue Waters team have benefited from that effort. So we asked for a little bit more, we got a little bit more, and then we 25K extra node hours, and then we were able to, in a few days, be able to have the entire Midwest Tier 2, more than half of the jobs running on the Midwest Tier 2 were actually running here at Blue Waters. So I think we have this part solved. This actually took quite a bit of effort. We can flow data through, we can simulate events, we can be a processing center. The machine learning part, okay, so I'm almost out of time, let me just finish up. So the machine learning part, we actually have a couple of interesting applications that we're pursuing. One of them is, so let me just list the three that we've kind of pursued on the Blue Waters supercomputer with our, with our initial allocation, and we want to do much more of this if we were able to get the larger allocation. Basically, one of the things we're doing is we're being able to training deep neural nets for doing electron, photon, pion discrimination, which is really important for many applications, especially looking for new phenomena in leading to soft or low energy particles. And so that's actually been a proof of principle has been done on blue waters. In addition to just stable particle identification and separating from different types of particles, we also have the ability to do higher level particle ID, for example, making Higgs taggers. And one of the things that's really important as we look for, now we've discovered single Higgs production, we're looking for double Higgs production, which actually allows you to map out the Higgs potential and has implications for the large-scale structure of the universe and understanding that by understanding the Higgs potential itself. And so you can make Higgs taggers, and we've worked a bit on that. And the third one, actually, we're developing a little bit of a collaboration with amongst Atlas and CMS and computer scientists and also theorists, is to try to work to make sustainable matrix element calculations. Let me just finish up here and say that we have this method. So we have training-based methods, training neural networks. Separate this signal from this background and do it really, really well based on the entire event information. Training-based machine learning. But we have this other thing we can do, which is an ab initio calculation of the probability density. So basically the probability density for an event X to give given a hypothesis alpha, where alpha might be the standard model. It might be a new physics model like supersymmetry. So we have this calculation that can be done ab initio. The problem is, and we can build a likelihood discriminant out of it. As I show you here, we can build likelihood ratios in the spirit of the Neyman Pearson lemma. And what we wind up having is essentially a very high-dimensional calculation. It's a high-dimensional integration of like 8 to 10 dimensions. And energy and momentum conservation also imposes that this calculation has very strongly peaked structures in certain regions of phase space. So it's like the worst possible integral you could do. But there are techniques to do it, and one of the things we are investigating is this can take, depending on the application, can take minutes per event, and we need many, 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 many millions and billions of such calculations. So we don't want to keep doing that over and over again. So one of the things we are studying is using deep neural nets to encode the complexity of that integration. That's sort of an idea we have that we've begun to pursue with a number of people that are interested in that. Okay, so I have the summary. The LHC program is in its early stages of a multi-decade exploration into the physics at the high energy frontier. Blue Waters provides a unique resource to extend the discovery reach of these experiments, which have shown discovery potential in the past through the Higgs and the Nobel Prize, as you saw. We've successfully deployed our application on Blue Waters, been able to simulate events, process data, and analyze it, as well as machine learning applications. And the one takeaway I want to give you is that what we're doing, I think through our application, we actually brought high throughput computing, not that it's been absent on Blue Waters, but we are one of the, we have a data intensive science that's driven some of the high throughput computing applications on our campus, like on the campus cluster and through our tier 2. And now we've brought that into Blue Waters, which is going to be really, really critical to sort of realizing the promise of these deep learning applications in high energy physics. So, in addition to just facilitating the data-enabled discovery. And I'll just mention also, some of us are working on, so I'm one of the co-PIs on a conceptualization of an NSF Scientific Software Innovation Institute. Dan's also involved in this. And some of these challenges are also being addressed through that initiative. And if you want more information on that particular thing, I can talk to you offline. Okay, thank you.